Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. So the topic what I'd like to focus on is Israel and diaspora. I want to start by just giving a little bit of kind of lay of the land as to why it is that it's a question that's personally interesting, and then how I imagine the 4 sessions go. I feel like it's the kind of topic that everybody's got. We all live it all the time, and I was trying to remember on the way up the stairs the children's book. There is this children's book that I can't remember the name. I used to read it to my kids, and it would describe. Basically, the point of the book was that the way in which a kid's imagination kind of pictures whatever, you're saying one thing and the kid is picturing something else, because whatever ideas they have already going on in their head, that's how they picture the kind of thing that you're saying. It would be better if I remember the name of the book, but I can't. I feel like this is one of those topics that we all spend a lot of time thinking about Israel, and we're living in the diaspora, and we have our kind of thoughts and feelings about Aliyah, etc. And I think that being able to have kind of learning together, but also talking together about it feels like a very important thing. But I assume that we all kind of come with our own kind of conceptions about it, and I hope we can develop some kind of shared language over the course of learning together. So where I come to this is to raise the question of, I want to kind of outline the questions on the page, just putting it down right, which is, how should we think about diaspora today when there are 2 thriving centers of Jewish life, one in Israel and at least one outside of Israel today? I think that when we talk about diaspora, the first thing that's important to do is clarify terms in some measure, because we associate, I'm not going to right now, but the idea of galut or exile and the word diaspora on their own, just as terminology, kind of can be referring to different kinds of things. Certainly, the way in which we think of life outside of Israel, for most of Jewish history, the idea of being in exile, the idea of kind of living in a diaspora, was reflective of not having a choice to be anyplace else. And so whatever the theology is, whatever the practical way of thinking about it, it was kind of rooted in, it's easy to think that you should be someplace else because you have no choice to be able to be in that other place anyway, pretty much. And so that's kind of one setting. Ultimately, what I'd like to focus on is what is the fact that you have how should we think about the relationship between Israel and diaspora and existing in diaspora in a context within which there are 2 major centers, and how does that differ? So, does everybody is Israel a place where every Jew should Jews believe that all Jews should live in Israel, like that, and just as a statement of fact? And it's easy to we have gut answers, I would say, to that question, but trying to spend some time thinking about it feels like it's an important thing. In terms of kind of highlighting the way in which it's different now, how to think about diaspora in the context of this kind of dual settings where we have 2 centers that are existing at the same time. So I want to highlight, first of all, a conceptual difference. I heard Moshe Halbertal say it first, and it's kind of a common thing to point to, that we are accustomed to this kind of binary of exile and redemption. Like Jewish history, you either live in exile or you live in a redeemed world. So either you're, concretely that means either we have a Beit HaMikdash and we're living, a first Beit HaMikdash, a second Beit HaMikdash, and ultimately, an ultimate redemption, or living in exile. That binary is not really what we're living in now. We have exile is not exactly exile. Is it a redemption? So the categories that we're used to don't quite fit the way that they normally, the way that I think we probably still use them, even if they don't exactly fit so much. And so it's kind of important to kind of put that out there. The second thing that draws me into this is an educational question, because one of the things I like for us to think about as a school is what's the message that we think we should be delivering. I kind of know what the message is that we are delivering, kind of. And I think that we should be more deliberate about thinking about what we want to say. So the way in which that question is framed in the context of our inner circle of teachers having conversation around the table is, we all know what Camp Moshava stands alone, and Bnei Akiva stands alone in that sense. It's like, they stand alone, right? I waited till you came to say that. Because they give a very clear message. Everybody should be in Israel, period. We're not giving that message. I don't know. Now, I don't think that makes us a non. I think we're a pretty Zionistic school, and I think we were strong supporters of it, of living in Israel, of state of Israel. And I think that there's a question there that is worth unpacking. There might be an answer, which is, yeah, we're just hypocrite. Maybe that's right. We're hypocritical. We should and we don't, and that's it. My gut tells me that, or the way that I experience it, is it's more complicated, more complex than that, and that there is a something to living outside of Israel and still being strongly Zionistic. And is there another way that can be talked about? Those are the two basic questions. One is kind of a conceptual question. One is an educational question. I almost, just for purposes of clarity, does that make sense? Or do people have kind of thoughts about not what your answer to those questions are, but just to those questions, kind of understanding whether that, I'm good with it like if you're saying, if you're thinking about whether you should, I want to encourage you to say whatever it is that you're thinking you might want to say.
Are you going to address the halachic aspect of this at all?
Not so much, but do you mean aliyah? Mm-hmm. No. And the reason why is because I think there's a lot of literature on that, and I think it's a meaning it's as much as that's the most important thing, I feel like we know that, and that serves as a cover to a lot of, I dafka don't. I don't want to, that's like, I feel like in the 70s and 80s, there's like a ton of tshuva, there's a lot of stuff that's written around it, and we'll all say whatever we say. Okay, no. So the next class, not this class, but what I wanted to do next is to draw if it's true that you have to think about diaspora, in one way of thinking about diaspora is, well, when you're in the diaspora, how do we understand that? That means from Churban Beit HaMikdash until the founding of the state of Israel. How do we understand that? And I'm just re-emphasizing, it's a different question. How do we understand it from 1948 till today? It might be the same answer, but it's a different question. You gotta say, okay, does that change anything? That second question is a question that I want to focus on, but we're gonna have to spend time on the first question a little bit in order to sort that out. But just to kind of jump ahead for a second, we might assume that it's very obvious that if there's a state of Israel, you should be living in Israel. If there is an option of living in Israel, you should live in Israel. And I'm going to want to point next time to two chunks of history, two periods where that was not the case. And what do we make of that? Not to draw a direct parallel, because circumstances are different, times are different, like everything's different. But the reality is that in the beginning of Churban Bayit Sheni, first of all, I'm going to want to spend a little bit of time on, there are three Sfarim in Tanakh that were written around that period: Ezra and Nehemiah, Daniel, and Megillat Esther. And they're speaking to that issue. And we're going to do next time, so like, okay, well, what was actually happening around this same issue then? The assumption that those Sfarim actually have different voices that they're contributing to the conversation. And then secondly, in the time of the Gemara, where you have a Talmud Bavli and a Talmud Yerushalmi, and you have a sugi in the Gemara, the Bavli, which actually focuses on this thing. Well, what's this, look at that. Okay, you got great rabbis. In your mind, which was greater, the Bavli or the Yerushalmi? I don't know if you want to take a stand on it, but we learn the Bavli. We don't learn the Yerushalmi, and that means something. So just in case, to the degree to which, just to kind of set up, maybe there is something that should be thought about, I would kind of set up that frame saying this is the third, and you can tell me if I'm missing something, but this is the third of a pretty illustrious, series. In the time, the beginning of Bayit Sheni, this is a kind of something similar to this kind of circumstance in some respect. In the time of the Gemara, there was something similar, at least right in this respect, to some degree. I don't want to overstate it, but in that sense. And now is a third time. So we would do well to kind of look at some of that. We're not going to, in one class or class and a half, be able to do all that. We'll do a little bit, but it's helpful even just to have that as a kind of a mindset, saying, okay, so I got diaspora. Actually, once I think about that as an issue, then I say, well, for most of Jewish history, by far, we lived in the diaspora. for some of Jewish history, and even some of the Jewish history where we had a country, there was still a diaspora. So we can say that diaspora is not good, but what do you make of the fact that like lots of people have been living in it over the course of time? And there can be one answer, which is they're all wrong. But there can be perhaps other answers, or others think about it too.
Not to focus on it, but why is it that we study Bavli and not Yerushalmi? Because of the quality of the stature of the Talmidei Chachamim?
It's certainly a topic of its own, but I guess one answer can be, I think the most basic answer is a literary kind of answer. The Bavli was edited, the community in Bavel existed far longer, and the work was, the Yerushalmi is much harder to read, much less edited, and the Bavli is much more edited. The community existed much longer, and the Gaonim, the continuity of the Jewish community, went from Bavel, stayed in Bavel, to the Gaonim, and then migrated to Rishonim, and etc. So something along, oversimplifying, something along those lines. Okay, so that being said, what I want to focus on first is forget the two centers for a second. Let's just think about diaspora. So when you think about diaspora, kind of the question is from the time of the Churban Bayit Sheni until 1948. So that's Golus or exile or diaspora. As a Jew, how am I supposed to look at that period of time? Like good or bad? Again, probably say, well, I don't know, it's like some good and some bad. Okay, but how am I supposed to, but still, the idea of thinking about we're supposed to be in Israel suggests that there's kind of an imperfection in living in the exile, and I think we should poke at that a little bit in terms of how it is that we think about it. I'll give as an example, and one of the things that I wrote I quoted in the blurb of things, Ruth Weiss, who's a professor of Yiddish literature at Harvard, and she wrote a book on Jews and power. And one of the sentences there was very striking to me. She writes, "The Jewish diaspora is one of history's boldest political experiments. An experiment as novel as the idea of monotheism itself and inconceivable without it. To live abroad meant to thrive as a nation without three staples of nationhood: land, a central government, and a means of self-defense." Now we actually sometimes talk about, what do you think she means when she says that? To me, this would be like a takeaway line. There's something like, I feel like, okay, it'd be good. I'd be happy if people left here at least and they had in their heads what. But one thing would be, there's a way of thinking about the diaspora as an amazing experiment, like an amazing chiddush that was brought to the world, the diaspora. So what's the big chiddush?
It's a miracle.
It's miraculous.
Yeah,
Yeah, use the word right. It's
still
miraculous.
exist.
So we can. So what do you make? What do we make of that? So you can say like it's Yad Hashem and finished, right? And again, I think that my nitiyah is to dig at that a little bit more. She actually looks at it and says like, well, how did that happen? How did it happen? If you want to explain it in ways that we can learn, you can always have bitachon. You should always also have bitachon. And as Mesilas Yesharim says, yesh bitachon, yesh hololus. There's one form. Sometimes you're trusting, and that's trust in God, and sometimes you would call it foolishness, depending on how much trust you have. So when you have faith, that's good. But you also have to have strategy that goes along with the faith to figure out how do you make that work. So what made Jews survive in the diaspora? How did that happen?
Chazal reinvented Judaism. They recreated Judaism. Okay,
so that's an enormous. If you believe that, right, then that's a very big deal to say something like that. It's borders on heresy, right? To say something like that. That's her second in the list here. That's her second piece of the kind of what was the blueprint for life outside of Israel. Adaptation to an extended exile. So Ezra Nehemiah will point to some point. Let's say Ezra brought out the Sefer Torah and read the Torah and said, and he did a certain kind of get rid of all your women, all the women, foreign women. Get rid of all the foreign women. Study the Torah. Start to keep Sukkot. Observe Rosh Hashanah. You got to keep Shabbos. That was like not a changing of the Torah, but it was an adapting from what was before. There was a tremendous kind of change of life that happened around that time. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is more profound. That's the one that I want to focus on here, because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, how do you live without a Beit HaMikdash? And basically created a society that was going to be able to live without a Beit HaMikdash. What are some of the changes that happened because of that? If we just had to point to the way life is different because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai decided to innovate and say you got to figure out how to live without a Beit HaMikdash.
Use the word heretical. What is that? Why were the changes? Could they be perceived as being heretical?
Well, we live in an age.
Heretical.
It's right. It was totally personal. The idea that Judaism changes in these days is a very threatening kind of idea, right? So to suggest that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai basically what he did was revamp a whole, kind of create a program that was going to allow the Jews to survive in Golus is I don't think it's a heretical idea, but it's something that can be unsettling for people. Like where do you come off doing that? So prayer, as kind of a basic fundamental, but that's like a big deal. That Torah study that already started before, right? But that Torah study that's like kind of creating a new society. So it suggests that adaptation is a big piece in that sense, and actually adaptation is a big piece in another sense. I mean, look at the way that we live our lives. How do we manage as citizens in America? Meaning, I don't mean in America as opposed to in a European country. I just mean if you look at us, we adapt to the society within which we live. We incorporate their values. We're all technological. We do all the things everybody else does, and somehow you got to figure out how to be able to manage. So adapting is one category. She has a very fascinating thing. The first piece she says about how we interpret catastrophe actually allowed us to survive. And this is a fascinating idea. She said that because we're religious people, we are never the victims, or in terms of Bayit Rishon, we were not. She's actually really talking about Bayit Rishon. What was the cause of the destruction of the temple and our being sent into exile? There are two possible answers to that question. One answer is the king of Bavel, Nebuchadnezzar. The other answer is yeah, or yes. Well, I'm going to say God, but yes, right? We defeated ourselves.
Right.
If you want to say that God caused that to happen, you want to say that we defeated ourselves and therefore God caused that to happen, that's all the same. But think of that idea, and it's explicit in Tanakh, or the people who read Tanakh carefully will say the different Sifrei Tanakh actually argue about whether to call Malachim and Divrei Yamim don't talk about this the same way. Is Nebuchadnezzar Shliach Hashem, or is Nebuchadnezzar an evil king? So the idea of Nebuchadnezzar being a Shliach Hashem, what does that mean? How can the person who did such a terrible thing be a Shliach Hashem?
Because even in our own defeat, we claim that relationship.
Yeah, right. And her argument, yeah. Please.
Paro is depicted that way.
Sorry?
Paro is depicted
Paro is
that
for
way.
sure, right. So the whole hardening, that whole idea, like it's interesting when you think about it that way, because we have moral problems. You can almost think about the formulation. We have like these moral problems. How can Paro be held responsible for that? But the emphasis is not, that's kind of a side of the question if you look at it that way. But also if you kind of look at it from the other side of the coin, the message is this is happening because God wanted that to happen, and that's the reason. So that kind of theology, she argues, actually allowed Jewish people to survive. You never lost.
Yeah. But after the Shoah, I think more people denigrated and became assimilated and wanted nothing to do with the Yiddishkeit, then people would say, oh, the Shoah has become religious.
Exactly, and that's why, although that's not our topic now, but that's why the Shoah is, first of all, I mean, I don't want to go off into that topic. That proves the argument, not disproves the argument, and it's being an exception, meaning nobody would say that Hitler was a Shliach Hashem. Nobody says that. Nobody. Well, there's one rabbi who said that we were punished for our sins, but most rabbis don't say that we were punished for our sins there either, and that's why there's a tremendous amount of literature of post-Holocaust theology. Like, how do you think? Because that's a paradigm-shattering idea. That doesn't mean that wasn't the paradigm. That was totally the paradigm, but can you still hold on to that paradigm after the Shoah? That's the question. So that doesn't negate her theory. She's saying if you look in Tanakh, you see pretty clearly that that's the way that it's that it's understood, and you see it even in the time of the Crusades. If you read that literature carefully, when we lose, we don't lose to the enemy. We're getting our just desserts. The flip side of getting your just desserts is that you're saying this happens not because we are kind of off the map, and so kind of dynasties can come and go, and Judaism will say we're still around. I find that just as a national psyche, kind of a very fascinating kind of idea. So that was her second idea. Yes.
But in addition to the positive, creating a diaspora society, I think anti-Semitism is another major causation of Jewish survival in the diaspora. Because, and that's in Sefer Dvarim also, it's like you won't find a place to rest the sole of your foot, you'll be tossed out of each country, that's the part of Jewish history that's kept us from totally assimilating into Spain or Germany or any of these countries.
Yeah, as you're saying it, you're right that this should be like a fourth thing, because the truth is that as she carries on in her book, the role of anti-Semitism is so present for her that she thinks that even with the state of Israel, anti-Semitism is as bad as it ever was, and that's and kind of because it's in the theme of her book in a certain sense, it doesn't get kind of mentioned here because it becomes, so you're right, I think it's fair to say, interpreting catastrophe, adaptation, anti-Semitism. Her fourth thing is what she calls a democratic Jewish polity. There are people who have written that in a very real sense it was a government by consent of the governed. Real democracy, this is arguable because Jewish Batei Din punished people also, and there's lots of pressure and all of that. But it is true in some sense that, like people will very often say that to be Jewish in America is a voluntary thing. It's you can stay or not stay. Nobody can force you, and so if you're staying, you're staying, and that's like a kind of very strong commitment. Now, I bring all of this only to say that does this make you feel like diaspora is positive or not, or just like it has nothing to, does it impact on the way in which you think of the phenomenon? It's a vague question. I feel like it's. I feel like if diaspora is I put this out there as in a way of thinking like if diaspora is a miracle, that's something. It's one of history's boldest political experiments. That means that something about a way certain people kind of arrange themselves and set themselves up, allow them to be able to survive. When you attribute it all to Yad Hashem, which we should, that's good and wonderful. That doesn't preempt our ability to also think about, okay, but what are the kind of on-the-ground concrete elements that have allowed for that kind of survival to happen? And that, to me, smacks of saying there's something very powerful in diaspora, which I'm going to take a drop further if you turn to the next page. I'm only kind of setting that as trying to kind of put out there, and this is where it's going to go. If we're going to find that there's a way of thinking about diaspora that it has something positive to it, then in founding the state of Israel, does that thing just kind of all go away because it was all in the interest of just being able to have a state? Once you have that state, it's finished? Or there's something actually about diaspora, and if it's true that there's something about diaspora, then even when there is a state, we should just think about what that thing is, so that because that was positive about the diaspora, because it would serve us well to know what those characteristics are and how they might continue to play in the existence of the Jewish people even after there's a state of Israel. Please ask clarification. Yeah.
Having amazing human environment. I'm still not sure what I'm supposed to do here, but I'm not sure I want to hear what the reasons are that it's okay. That was just like a idea that sort of had to work, and all these adaptations came to be because of exile, because we couldn't be in Eretz Israel. So it's like this. To me, it's like this big idea. It's like because it's here, it has. It's like when people left Europe, they went to China. My in-laws were in Shanghai. The institutions they built, they had to adapt. They had to keep the community going. And I think a lot of
Is anybody game to take?
But a lot of good came of that. I think it is.
Well, that's it. Is anybody game to take a counter side to that? And I'm going to kind of keep on trying to remind us that I think that we can all be like really strong Zionists in the room and discuss that issue,
yes,
right? And it's not like I don't want it to get into. Can I be like a strong Zionist and still say, well, let me counter that with something?
Yeah.
Like, what would you push for? Yeah.
I think we've only been discussing it as is it good for the Jews or not good for the Jews. I think the one positive for the diaspora that we're not discussing is it good for the world? Is it necessary for, the theological idea of like for world redemption, Jews have to be going all over and gathering the sparks and whatever until we reach such point as the world is in a moral state that we can have a different kind of redemption.
What might that mean if you take the sparks and you think about them in like real terms, like a concrete, like what do you think of when you talk about
You
that?
have to bring morality, you have to bring monotheism, like think of all the countries of the world.
So I'm going to say,
Pre-Christianity,
before anybody like jumps to defend against that threatening, I wasn't thinking you were, but I just want to make sure that you can kind of sit with those two and allow them to both like live, that there's a really important thing that we believe, which is about kibbutz goyah, living in Israel, establishing a nation state in a homeland and all of that. There is something that we think as Jews, which is that we're supposed to, there's something more cosmopolitan, I don't know, like kind of connecting to the rest of the world and having an impact on that. There's always a danger in that it has more of an impact on us than we have on them. That's not a question, but that's a big idea. So somebody might, after I said don't counter, somebody might counter even respectfully and say like, I think the best way to do that is by having a state and then modeling that for everybody. Well, somebody might counter.
How's
well,
that working?
Okay, right. Somebody, I wasn't going to counter that way just yet, but right. You have to start it, but I will suggest to start to think, well, what might make it hard to do that if you just have just have the state and model. Like how you start to think, when you say how's that working, and it's like, well, why is it so hard? Like, what is it about it that's so hard? Don't answer that, because I don't want to go there now. But I do want to put those two ideas on the table. And the page 2 is just to present two out of what could be very many. Can I give you a sheet? Just to contrast two modes of thinking. One which is much more they're both classic in their own rights, but when we daven Musaf every Yontif, we basically say this line, and I think it's good to just read it together so that when we say it, when we daven Musaf, we pay attention to it in this way, like it kind of comes and goes. But in Musaf we say, we say that the reason why we are in Golos is because we sinned. And we are distanced from our land. We can't be ole regel and bow before you. Why can't we worship HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Beit HaMikdash? Because of the hand that was outstretched, that stretched out, meaning that beat, that destroyed the Beit HaMikdash. And that's why it can't be. Yeah.
When was this written?
I didn't check the date. I meant to and I forgot, but I don't know. I'm going to get back to it. I mean, my ish guess is that it's, my ish guess would be 1,000-ish years old. It's going to be my guess, but I don't know. I don't know if it's in but I'm guessing. But I'm going to find out. Yotzam l'fanecha Hashem Elokeinu Elokei Avotenu Melech Rachaman shetashuv u'trachem aleinu v'amikdashcha b'rachamecha rabim v'tivneim heira utgadil kvodo. This is a prayer for rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash. Avinu Malkeinu galei kvod malchutcha aleinu mehira. Reveal the glory of your kingdom quickly. V'ofav yinasei aleinu kol chai. And you should lift us up before all living beings. V'karei pzureinu v'bein hagoyim should gather, right? There should be an ingathering of the exiles, l'nfutzotenu, and those who are nafot, those who are spread around, kanes, like Beit HaKnesset. You should gather them in. Unfutzotenu, those who are spread out, kanes miyarketei aretz, from the legs, meaning the far reaches, right? Unfutzotenu kanes miyarketei aretz. You should gather the Jews from the far reaches of the land. You should return us to Tzion with joy. We should return to Yerushalayim. And there we'll be able to bring the korbanot as we once did. And that is a certain kind of idea. I want to contrast that idea with a later idea, but the Maharal is not some modern something. Maharal is living in Prague in 17th century, and is a classic text, and he spent a lot of time on Gos, trying to explain, like, what are we doing here? How's that happen? He's got a whole theology of Gos. I want to start with the bottom one. So Maharal says, he's talking about the, I'm actually not going to start with the bottom one, I'll start with the one above it. Maharal writes in Netzach Yisrael, Ikar Shiflut Yisrael Shem Psurim Bein Ha'amim. The main, I'm going to say that loud. Let me say like this, just orally. He says, our natural tendency is to think that the fact that Jews are spread all over the world is a sign of our weakness. That's a terrible thing, that we're spread all over the place. I'm going to start, and he says, when you look at the Jews spread all over, you assume that that's a sign of failure. I'm going to start actually with the third line, in the middle of the line. It says, Hinei neva'er lecha bera'ayot brurot. I'm going to explain to you with clear proof, Ki moreh pizur Yisrael b'chol ha'olam, al ma'ala elokit shalahem. That the fact that Jews are spread around the world is a sign of their divine status. Now you can try to do whatever reconciling you want between different sources. It's very hard. I mean, there's a certain theology that's saying we're here because we sinned. You can say like, well, we sinned, and now once we're here, you can do whatever move you want like that. But if you actually internalize the idea that's being presented on the assumption that it's going to kind of shape the way that you understand your existence in the world, Mipnei Chata'enu is shaping a certain kind of understanding of existence, just saying, we are here because we sinned. And you play that out in your mind, you can identify, you can recognize how as an individual and as a family and then as a community and a society, I can develop a group of people actually, that's how we think about it. The fact that we're here is a sign of an imperfection and we're supposed to get out of here. The fact that we're here is a sign that we have not yet improved to the point that we can return. Now, and that can shape a whole way of living. And the idea of thinking that being in exile is a sign of our divine, the divine nature of the Jewish people, it generates a very different kind of feel. Like when it's, and you have to ask yourself, like, why? What is divine? What is divine about that? And he says, "V'zeh ki kasher hayu Yisrael b'artzam haya mekomam kasher ra'ui." When they were in their land, it meant okay that they were in their land. That's it. It's like, I mean, I don't know why this is the first analogy. I'm like living in high school. It's like we SAR decided to open an elementary school, and they opened an elementary school in 1969, whatever it was. Okay, and then it was 1979 and 1989, 1999, and then finally 2003 they said we're going to open a high school. So what does that mean? What's the story of that? The story is, okay, you know what? It's time. We've gotten this elementary school down. It's the greatest place. We want to expand it to like the next level. So the Maharal says the Jews go to Israel, and they're in Israel because that's like the right place for them. And then there comes a time where it's supposed to be, okay, now you have to move past that. You have to move to the next level. We're actually going out there and doing something in the world beyond that. That's a very it's a very dramatic kind of idea. Let's read a little bit more. Anything that has a place, he's basically saying things settle in the place that's appropriate for them. Think of moving water, right? Moves and then it lands wherever it is that it's supposed to land. Every object as it is has a certain space, has its own place. Sorry for the v'davar zeh kvar ba'er lamala. If something leaves its designated place, that means that it is lost, which could allow you to say that the Jewish people therefore are lost. No. Let's go to the end of the next line. Meaning, so where should Jews be? In the holiest place, which is in Israel. But, end of that line, but when they go into exile, Ki Yisrael heim hikar ha'olam. In other words, when Jews go into Golus, why are they spread all over the place? Because why did God create the world, according to the Maharal? Because the Jews had a mission to deliver in the world. They created, Maharal says, the world's created for Jews. You can argue however you want about what the Maharal, and it's a discussion about the Maharal's kind of ethnocentric kind of way of thinking about things. But when they spread out, they spread it all over the place. וכבר אמרנו כי ראוי שיהיה המקום מתייחס לבעל המקום. וכך נתפזרו בכל העולם. That's why they were spread around the whole world. שכך הוא ראוי לאומה שהיא כל העולם, שיהיה מקומם בכל העולם. That the nation who is the nation of the world, their place should be in the world, the entire world. That's why it's supposed to be so. And then the piece below it, Rav Shagar wrote an article about exile, about Galut and the Sukkah, whatever, and he quotes these two pieces. The one below is about the Meraglim. It's like a fascinating idea that the Maharal writes. The Meraglim are very famous for crying, Heim bachu b'chiyah shel chinam. They cried for no reason. They cried unnecessarily. What was the unnecessary? So the b'chiyah shel chinam, according to the Maharal, is as follows. They were told by Kadosh Baruch Hu that they weren't going into the land of Israel. So what was their reaction? They cried. Maharal says they shouldn't have cried. You know why they cried? They didn't recognize what they were supposed to, what their mission was, which was what? To still wander around amongst different nations and deliver their message. Almost like the Meraglim are the kind of the first diasporists in that sense. They were the first people who were supposed to realize if God says stay out, then He's supposed to stay out because there's something for you to do. Now, I'm not trying to sell this idea. I think what I am trying to sell is that there are different ideas and that it's okay to kind of hold on to both of them. So the question at the top of the page was, if I wanted to overly simplistically ask the following question: how do you read the diaspora as a Jewish person? How do you relate to our past in the diaspora as a Jewish person? Do you see it as kind of an aberration of Jewish existence, or do you see it as a real part of Jewish existence? I would, again, oversimplifyingly say, Mipnei Chatainu is teaching a theology that says diaspora is like not, that's an aberration. It's not what's supposed to be. And the Maharal is suggesting that the diaspora that's a part of what the Jewish mission is supposed to be, is to be able to be out there and interact and to bring the sparks and be able to do all those kinds of things. I say that only as like marking points of value, so that then when we think about like, okay, what are we supposed to bring to like try to fill in the gaps, like what are you supposed to bring to the world and etc. Then think about, okay, well, when you have a state, do you give up on those things, or are there ways in which you're still supposed to have those things play out in other ways, etc. So that's just to note that. I'll stop for a second if there are comments or questions while you turn to page 3. Yeah.
What does the role of that state then play in the lives of Jews all over the place, in Israel and outside?
Right. So I just again to stop for a moment to talk about the way I want to. The next time I want to actually talk about the two precedents of having two centers, the Ezra Nehemiah, that period, and the Bavli Yerushalmi. And then the two after that, I want to try to talk about it in terms of kind of political the idea of the nation state, and the way in which kind of that's good or not good as an idea and what that means for Jews. And then the fourth one to talk about peoplehood and whether the Jewish people are, is it a center-periphery model? Is it a two-centered model? How you manage that? So one is more political and one is more kind of our understanding of community. So I hope to be able to touch on those in some sense as we move forward. I wanted to raise a second question basically on page 3, which also raises the same thing. If you can hopefully at this point acknowledge, kind of think that there's a way to think about the diaspora while thinking that we should ultimately be in Israel, but there's something positive about the diaspora or not, then you'd ask the following question. I'd like to raise it from a political, from a sovereignty perspective. What's Jewish life really supposed to be? Like when we talk about living in Israel, so living in Israel as an individual, we don't usually think carefully about the difference between I should live in Israel, or Jews should be sovereign in Israel, and what might be the difference between those two. I mean, that can cut in different directions. Jews can be sovereign in Israel without me being there, and I can live in Israel without Jews being sovereign in Israel. And so those issues have to be split apart in order to think about it well, right? Like what actually are we talking about when we talk about living in Israel. And the truth is, I don't think we're going to get into it, but you think about, for sure, a machlokas rishonim about when you talk about living in Israel, right? We all say, do we think, if you kind of went through halacha, we went through the sugya, whatever, would you think that you're supposed to be in Israel? Yes. What does that mean? Very strong argument can be made that the Rambam thinks that means you should have a king that is ruling in Israel, and the Ramban means that you should live in Israel, which unfairly, I'll say, right, I have no basis for saying it's not, the Ramban moved to Israel from Spain and lived in a churva, right, basically there, and the Rambam lived in Egypt just across the river and didn't live in Israel, and the Rambam included Eretz Yisrael stuff in Hilchos Malachim, and the Ramban criticized the Rambam for not counting it as a separate mitzvah. There's something there in terms of whether the mitzvah is that individuals should live in Israel or whether Jews should. It's the same thing with having the shul has to have Kriyas Torah. Am I obligated to? Probably it means I am not obligated to hear Kriyas Torah. The shul has to have Kriyas Torah, and I should want to participate. But that's like a different. So they're kinds of kind of splits like that. Yes.
I just think there's a similar question on the galut side of the equation, which is that what does it mean? What is the point of? What is the value of being in galut? That I love the phrase "we're the messengers who have forgotten the message."
Yeah.
In other words, that we as a nation seem to have, to a large degree, forgotten what it means to be Jewish and why. Well, why we do this.
Yeah.
So I think just like you're asking that question about what is the nature and quality of life in Eretz Yisrael, a similar set of questions can be asked about galut as well.
Absolutely, I agree 100%. So what I'd like to do here is to just point to a similar machlokas about how to think about the Jewish nation and sovereignty as it relates to diaspora between two 19th century and into the 20th century thinkers. And I'm again here taking from Ruth Weiss's quote for Gretz, the famous historian, and then we'll read a piece from Simon Dubno, who's a tremendous scholar in the end of the 19th into the 20th century and a famous diasporist. He, B'shita, thought that Jews should establish communities outside of Israel and that's where we should go, and was, there are diasporists who are more and diasporists who are less in favor of the Zionist enterprise. He thought he was a real diasporist. He thought Jews should live in exile, in diaspora. But let's read. So Gretz is like this. This is again reading Ruth Weiss. When modern Jewish thinkers began to study the Jewish past, they too divided history into before and after. The great historian Heinrich Gretz separated the predominantly political character of the pre-exilic period from the overriding religious stamp of the exile. That's the phrase. So it's like stop for it, right? What's Judaism supposed to be? Political at its core. Judaism is political. I actually wonder, given all of our support for Israel and our natural leaning like that, which I'm feeling like, my assumption is that the idea, Israel has to have to kind of push against that a little bit. But if I ask the other question, which is, do you think Judaism is political at its core, or do you think it's a religion?
Which Judaism?
I'm actually, just by a show of, I'm assuming that our natural reaction is Judaism is a religion, not political at its core. Yeah, I'm saying, right. So I'm only, correct. I just mean, that's important to kind of pay attention to. So Gretz says, no, it's actually political at its core, and if you think it's a religion, you've lost something. There's a reason why we think that, but that's not what it's supposed to be. Yes?
Well, most of the mitzvot that are talui ba'aretz are politically motivated, and Shemitah and like a Chikachapeya, all of those things are really how to form a just society.
Right.
And when we're separated from the land, we don't have the opportunity to implement that. So we can, of the 613, we have a limited number of mitzvot that we can implement in the diaspora. So that's why it's become more important.
Is there a danger in thinking about? As you're saying it, it just reminded me of this very famous thinker who thought that Judaism also was political at its core, and therefore dumped it when he said, this is not what it's supposed to be. It's totally messed up. It's totally off. Spinoza's big Chiddush, right? One of his many way before his time kinds of ideas was that he said, I totally agree with Gretz. That's why you're all wasting your time. This is not, what are you doing? That's
and
not.
they agree with Rambam, right? So
What?
and you were saying that's
And of
Rambam
course,
too.
yeah, although the Rambam is I mean, as all things with Rambam, and this one in particular, he's not clear about it. You have to really infer it from where he places the mitzvot. So it's a little, there's some, you should kind of check the Rambam, see whether you find that argument compelling, as opposed to other places where he's much clearer about it. But yes. So let's finish here. So this one says, according to Gretz, Judaism was originally not a religion at all, but a constitution of a body politic. The idea of the Word of God was originally meant to work itself out not theologically, but in the living history of the Jewish people. I think this probably resonates, right? Only after the exile did religious interests gain exclusive control, so that Judaism ceased to be the constitution for a state and became religion in the usual sense of the word. Taking politics to mean that which concerns the state and its institutions, historians following Gretz assumed that with the dispersion, Jews had ceased to function as a political people. Now, Ruth Weiss's book, is not on our topic, even though I'm quoting from her. What she wants to actually discuss is whether Jews actually were a political people even when they were in exile, which is an interesting topic, but not Jewish politics, right? We were in exile. There's like tons of Jewish politics, right? So there's still what to talk about in that regard. But Gretz's idea is that Judaism is at its core a political body and not a religion, and existing as a religion is an aberration of what it's supposed to be.
Well, that's too extreme.
That's why Spinoza got.
I mean,
It's what?
It's based all on monotheism. I mean, if we're saying all of this is very Abraham-esque, like we're all ambassadors in the diaspora, that's the basic tenet, monotheism.
Is it too extreme? Did I say? I mean, actually, I don't even remember what I said. Did I say Gretz too extremely, or is Gretz too extreme?
I think there's a quote here from Gretz, and I think Gretz is being too extreme.
Oh, okay.
And he's discarding religion
All
completely.
right, I just want to make sure if I didn't say it. Yeah. Okay.
So what do you do with the whole opposition to politics to the kingdom?
With Sefer Shoftim,
Yeah.
I mean.
Shoftim and Shmuel and
Right. Now, the question is, if it's political at its core, then why does it seem that we don't really want a king? What do you think?
Back to religion, yeah.
It's-
Well, the idea of Jews having a king
Right.
was resisted by Shmuel and all of Sefer Shoftim, where it seemed to be like a kingdom of God. That's the.
But that's a
but
detail.
that's-
I mean, it's still about establishing a political structure. We can argue about whether the king is
I
is
think
an
that's
ideal or
probably
not.
right. Yeah, I think it's probably right. I would say. Yes.
When you're given a land to begin with, you have to assume that there'll be politics to run the land.
Yeah. Right. That's good proof. Right. I think that's right. That makes total sense. I think that what bothers somebody like Simon Dubnov or people who are diasporists then is, well, if that's really true, then man, out of even during Beit, how many years did Jews have sovereignty? How many years did Jews actually have sovereignty? Forget about the Beit HaMikdash for a second. Sorry, forget about the Beit HaMikdash. But when the Jews had Beit Sheni, they were not sovereign. They were governors over their territory, but they were under Persian rule, gave them the right to do that. So if it's true that not just politics, but sovereignty is actually what Judaism is about, in the entire course of Jewish history, how many sovereign years did Jews have?
Very few.
Very few. I can't give you the exact number because I
Right.
should have it on the top of my head, but 100+ years during Beit Rishon and during Beit Sheni, the Maccabim conquered Israel in 165, whatever the year is, 163, until 70, and that's it? Out of 3,000, that's like a big kasha. You know what I mean? It's like, if you want to say, it's like, okay, that's fine, but your whole history was not that. So that's a good question. Yeah.
But doesn't Mipnei Chatzeinu Galinu
Yes,
Galinu-
it does. It's just a question of whether, meaning you can, I'm not, right, you can close the conversation if you only have one. I'm only arguing that Jews have thought different things and that I think it's good to think different things and that there are, not just for plural, meaning around this, I think there's a lot of our history bears out that there have been lots of positives and strong things that have come from different places that are worth at least thinking about, different values. Again, right, I can't argue with that. Although I really don't believe that when pushed against the wall, most people really believe. What's interesting to me here, and this would be like a good topic for just the conversation, and I wouldn't do that like in a live stream kind of way, but I wonder how much people believe in in everything else. I mean, do we live our lives in a kind of theology, in terms of, I mean, it's a pretty, again, working with a community of people, I'd say it's pretty, it's quite a mix of people. Right, yeah, exactly, right. Right.
I hope it's then beyond, but I think that's when we
Feel it?
If you feel it, that's when you're going to feel it.
And I think we ignore the other side of it, and I think that I don't want to ignore the other side of it. There's like another way that we live, there's another part of our lives, there's another dimension that needs to be like unpacked. And we talk to one side of it, but we don't talk, to the other side of it, which I think should be kind of brought out and talked about. It makes it, kind of paying lip service in some ways. We're not understanding all the dimensions that we're existing in. I want to finish up. So Dubno writes like this. There is, however, a still more rigid test for the maturity of a nation. When a people loses not only its political independence, but also its land, when the storm of history uproots it and removes it far from its natural homeland, and it becomes dispersed and scattered in alien lands, and in addition loses its unifying language, if despite the fact that the external national bonds have been destroyed, such a nation still maintains itself for many years, creates an independent existence, reveals a stubborn determination to carry on its autonomous development, such a people has reached the highest stage of cultural, historical individuality and may be said to be indestructible if only it cling forcefully to its national will. I'm going to ask you what you think that whole line means in a second. We have many examples in history of nations that have become dispersed among other nations. We find only one instance, however, of a people that has survived for thousands of years despite dispersion and loss of homeland. This unique people is the people of Israel. What do you think it means? Why would he think that this is like the highest form of whatever, if only it clings to its its national will? Why is that highest?
It's certainly the biggest test of that ability to remain a quantifiable, known entity, identifiable.
What does it not have that a nation does? Like, why is it a bigger test than having it? They're pretty hard to run a nation.
Land and political structure.
And power, which means power.
Power.
Right. So, I mean, that kind of suggests that power is it's not a question that, for Dubno, the idea of national, we're going to get back to the nation-state idea, but I would ask you to start thinking a little bit about whether you think, forgetting about whether you can imagine the world functioning without nation-state power, right?
What does national will mean?
What does that mean? What do you think it means? As long as it can cling forcefully to its national will. Probably, yeah. But I would think that what it at least means, and the reason why it's the highest form, is that nobody's forcing, you're not doing it because you're going to be thrown in prison if you don't do it. And again, you can counter-argue that I'm going to be socially ostracized, I'm not going to get a Leon job, at the end of the day, this is my community. And those things are true, too. I'm not minimizing that. Well, the reason why, right, it doesn't matter in the sense that if you wanted to, you could pick up and leave it, and you choose to stay, and so it doesn't, well, what does what matter? Am I asking the wrong question?
I was trying to strengthen the question, I think, is that the reason all that is important to us is part of why we've managed to remain. In other words, we've created a structure that places value on all that.
Yes, and therefore, I just lost what the question before, so now I connect it back, but yeah.
National will, what defines national will? And it's whatever you said. Do you remember? The concept that he said the most basic thing is that it's voluntary, is that people.
In its own strange sense, right? I mean, it's.
Every Jewish person that I know pretty much, except, groups of people come from, define themselves as Jewish in a different way. So it is quite miraculous that all of these antennae.
Yes,
right.
my association when I read something like this is like is like when I would tell kids, it's hard for them to appreciate it, that I think that the Siddur is the most amazing miracle. It's like a miraculous thing. You can travel to any place in the world at any period in history, and you're going to have something that's pretty much the same prayer book, even with its differences. How do you think that happened? That's like a crazy. So you'll say, so if you're living in a neighborhood, okay, that's impressive. That you can go anywhere in the world and that you can have that you got the same kind of basic set of, that's a miraculous thing. And Dubnov says, that's an amazing thing. And you're doing that without coercion, without power, without force, that's a tremendous message. So I think that what you have here is one very powerful message that's saying, Jews having sovereignty to be able to enact what the Torah says, that's the most amazing thing in the world. And you have another message that says, Jews being able to show what it means to be a nation without any coercive structure, just because you believe in the same kinds of things, no matter where you are and under what period of history, that's an amazing thing. So which one do you like better? So, and I'm going to give my cards, right? Give it away at the beginning, right? But it's not a question to me. They're just like, why would you pick one of those things? Those are two enormous, gifts that Judaism is putting out there that you want to hold on to. That's something that's really strong. Yeah.
The political came first, to put the land together and so forth, and the religion reinforced the unity of the people.
Anybody want to argue that one? Did the politics come? Did the political come
Depends
first?
where you want to start counting.
Depends where you want to start the story. Yeah. You can tell that's meaning it's certainly a legitimate version of the story, but look at Chumash, for example.
Moses didn't get into Israel.
We don't start at Chumash.
We don't start it exactly.
Before.
We don't start at Hachodesh Lachem starts it because the first thing that you do is to establish your rule is you take over. The calendar is big. There's a reason why the calendar is the first thing that you start with. We don't do that. We start with creation, Avra, like all kinds of individual. I think that says something. So again, there are different stories that you can tell. You can't say like one is the right story, one's the wrong story. But they're pushing at different things. We're running out of time, so I'm going to finish. So Weiss, just the way that she writes about Dubnov, she writes, locating Jewish strength precisely where materialists would have sought its weakness. Dubnov believed with Herman Cohen that Jews could claim preeminence in the modern world not in spite of, but on account of their lack of political power. He expected Jews to remain strong national minorities wherever they lived in sufficient numbers, maintaining their national distinctiveness through language, culture, education, and social institutions. This idea is an idea that we're going to get back to again, and whether you can be like a Zionist and be thoughtful about that kind of idea as well. Are you shaking your head this way because you don't like it?
No, I'm just shaking my head because it's so difficult to know what they would say if they were living at the time of the State of Israel. They didn't have an option.
Yeah.
I mean, Dubnov maybe because of the Zionist Congress and everything, but all these ideas are really fascinating, but like the Maharal.
It's not relevant anymore.
Exactly.
Right.
I missed the beginning. Are you differentiating between exile and diaspora?
I just noted that one should, but I didn't really talk about it. Exile, for sure that when they use the terminology, they use it differently. Diaspora, being in exile is a religious term that's to being thrown out of your country because, it doesn't have to be a religious term, I shouldn't say that either. But somebody who's living in diaspora is not, maybe we'll do it, and we'll point to it and do it more structured, more properly, but they should be distinguished, yeah.
Should be.
Yeah.
So are we saying that the diaspora is positive for us as Jews, for the Jewish community, or are we saying that diaspora is positive because we're reliant on the nation, or also because when we're in diaspora, maybe we feel more Jewish, we become more religious?
I don't know if I have to pick between those. Maybe all of the above in some respect, yeah. Maybe Judaism is enriched because they live amongst other nations, and the other nations are enriched because they live amongst Jews, and I think it's all of them. I think it's all of those. I think it's all of the above. The only thing I would say, what I would, I think that cuts in both directions. It could cut in the direction of saying if you only had a state of Israel, and people say, I don't know, I'm just going to leave it at that. Yeah. Zionism. So I want to read a little bit of Zionist, how did the Zionists read the diaspora? So given that we put 2 ways of reading the diaspora, the Zionists definitely, classic Zionist thinking took a very clear stand. So this is just a summary. Yael Zerubbabel is an Israeli woman, professor here. She's now, I think, at Rutgers. She wrote a great book called Recovered Roots, which basically tries to show how classical Zionism, through education, and it's the way that they kind of educated their kids, popular culture, the way that kind of history was taught, and all of those things, the way in which they created a particular Zionist narrative, not in order to say like, well, this was, when you teach, by definition, as a teacher, say by definition, you can only include some stuff, and you can't include everything, and you make a decision. If they're going to write, if somebody from the, if we teach a lot more, the European history is taught here much more than African history or the history of the Far East or whatever. Somebody can say like, well, what do you make decisions about what you're going to teach, and that's important to kind of unpack and figure out. And the same thing was true for what Zionists were communicating. It's not just about education, it's about a culture at large. And so she describes it like this. The Zionist binary model of Jewish history portrays antiquity as a positive period, contrasted with a highly negative image of exile. Since the main criterion for this classification is the bond between the Jewish people and their land, the period of exile is essentially characterized by a lack. The dispersion to many localities resulting from the loss of direct contact with the land thus undermined the Jews' shared experience of nationhood. During centuries of exile, religion functioned as the adhesive bond for the dispersed Jewish communities, but this exilic way of life was a poor substitute for the earlier national phase, thus conveying a process of spiritual degeneration as well as political regression. Zionist collective memory thus constructs exile as a long, dark period of suffering and persecution. Jewish life in exile constituted a recurrent history of oppression punctuated by periodic pogroms and expulsions, a fragile existence imbued with fear and humiliation. Socialist Zionist leader David Ben-Gurion stated that exile consists of histories of persecution and legal discrimination, inquisition, pogroms, self-sacrifice, and martyrdom. I don't know if you feel like, yes, that's the way that I was taught Jewish history, or no. I think largely that's the way that I was taught Jewish history, and I think that there's lots of history that's been written to try to say there certainly were a lot of this, but there certainly were a lot of other things also that were going on that are important part of understanding what, Jews didn't just flourish in, that little window of Yehuda Levi was able to, I don't know, if you'd speak to my father about what it was to live in Poland in 1930, he would say like that was unbelievable. And they lived as a collective minority, and there was poreh and so many different. You get the point. The highly negative perception of exile often turned from shlilat hagalut to shlilat hagolah, and I just want to make sure that those terms are kind of known and for our discussion. Right, the Zionists believed in shlilat hagalut, which was the negation of the exile, or the diaspora, which means that period in history was all was lack. And what she tries to show in the book is the ways in which, the fascinating part of the book is that she talks about 3 events, Bar Kokhba, Mitzada, and Tel Chai, 2 in antiquity and 1 modern. And basically she shows how all of them, first of all, were not, the ancient ones, rabbis were not, there's nothing about Masada in any rabbinic texts, and Bar Kokhba is only talked about negatively in rabbinic texts. And for the Zionists, Masada and Bar Kokhba were tremendous. Masada and Bar Kokhba first, and then Tel Chai. Masada and Bar Kokhba were taught very powerfully, and Tel Chai became kind of the beginning, the significance of Tel Chai, the pilgrimages to the monument and all that was an enormous thing. And she's kind of describing what it was, how it was taught in the, in the 1930s, the 20s, 30s, 40s, and how those things took off, and what how the tiulim which were sakanat nefashot in those days, the way that she describes it. I'm taking her word for it about the details she's putting about to go to Masada, not just they didn't have the path or the cable car. It was like getting there was crazy. With the way she described, the way it's described in books, like a crazy. It was really unbelievable thing. Yeah, right. And that's. But what she's arguing is that that's not Jewish. That's a new way to teach Jewish history. I mean, the way they say is they taught Jewish history from Masada to Tel Chai Masada Bar Kokhba to Tel Chai, events that were not part of the narrative until that point. And what does that say about the way that you're telling the story? So I'm out of time, so I'm gonna stop. There is no question, I think, that classical Zionist education and classical Zionist thinking about the diaspora is one of Shlilat HaGalut, which is that time period. But what she writes also that kind of slips into Shlilat, what's the one? Shlilat HaGolah, meaning looking at the people funny, right, and saying like, you're not the real Jews, and all that kind of played with that. I really do not mean, I'm going to qualify one more time, and I'm going to be apologetic, maybe I shouldn't. I'm not, I actually do really believe that there's something very positive about both of these things, and I do believe. And I'm kind of working with an assumption about what we think and kind of pushing in the other direction. I just want to kind of we're going to talk a little bit about people who are clear Zionists, people who are kind of clear diasporists, but then kind of some kinds of versions in between. I think it's like having some of the building blocks to understand, well, how could I put the pieces together so that I think like this, and how might somebody have put the pieces together think like that? That's important. So I just wanted to put, first of all, some of those questions out there. The two, for what we did, just to summarize, as in terms, one kind of theological, like both of them have to do with how do you read the diaspora, like how, forgetting the two centers thing, like what happens now when you have both at the same time, but how do you look at Jewish history? Do you look at all of diaspora as an aberration, or do you look at it as tremendous, having its tremendous successes? Do you look at it as a sign of punishment from God, or do you see it as a sign of a kiyum of something that God wanted from us also? Do you see it as the lack of sovereignty and political power in that kind of classic sense, and therefore missing something? Or do you see it as lacking in sovereignty and that classic political power, and therefore offering something unique to the way in which we generally conceptualize these kinds of things? So that is supposed to serve as a frame for being able to go forward. And the last thing I'll say, just to go back to for a second, is that I think for that thing, the significant, that's a little bit why it's striking to me to think about how did the Babylonians, how did the Talmidei Chachamim in Bavel think about that question? How did the, Nehemiah, who lived he went to Israel, went back, right? What do you draw on? What do you see from those people? What were they thinking? Because they were living in that time, and they were still kind of making those kinds of decisions. Okay, we'll stop here. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.